Chapter 17 Book of Echoes. With only the glow of the stone for a guide, Ember had no means of tracking the passing hours, but he was so tired that it must have been nearly dusk when Kentucky pricked her ears and made a sudden sound, of alarm, surprise or something else entirely. She dashed ahead of him, leaping a skeletal warrior which lay in the middle of the corridor. Pieces of rusted metal clattered in her wake as she clipped it with her foot, and in an instant she had disappeared from the circle of golden light. "Kentucky!" Ember shouted, his voice thunderous in the cavernous hall. "Come back! Where are you off to?" Her soft footsteps faded into nothing. "She's going to kill me." A thought he had squashed down deep inside himself ever since her pale face and bulbous eyes had appeared in the amber stone light, looking like the demon in the dark from that old rhyme. But now it came rushing back, stronger than before, and Ember stopped cold in the middle of the hall. Dead men lay at his feet. And, here and there, dead others with sharp fangs which reminded him, sickeningly, of Kentucky's grinning face. Perhaps they were not sirens. Some other foul creature may have passed out of both human and siren memory. Whatever they were, it was impossible not to pass judgment on who had attacked whom. "Peace, Ember. Don't lose your nerve now. Nowhere to go but onward." So on he went, one step, one breath, at a time. The hall grew steadily brighter, and upon glancing up he noticed a few pinpoints of light very far above him. Lanterns, perhaps? Tapestries hung down, moldering, moth-eaten, threadbare tapestries, each perhaps 20 times his height and nearly as wide as the great hall itself. They were too distant to make out their designs, but he decided that anything of such magnificence must have been woven with a great deal of care. The carved walls grew smoother and more polished, and the rock itself seemed slightly luminous. Ember glanced at the stone in his hand, and then paused long enough to touch the wall. Cold. But a misty halo of light brushed his fingers. He hid the stone under his shirt, and the aura of the mountain itself was just enough to see by. It grew stronger in places and weaker in others, as if veins of living, glowing, pulsing blood ran beneath the rock. The stone-like Kentucky had awakened from its slumber seemed almost dead by comparison. "Perhaps that's what this is," he mused, distracted by the absurdity. The mountain's blood. A flow of magic. As Ember began to truly take notice of how sore his feet were, and how much he wished to stop and rest, he was beset by the gloomy thoughts he had attempted to shove aside. Thoughts of his cabin, the quiet river, the chatter and gossip at the tavern late at night. A shout startled him back to the present. "Ember!" Kentucky's voice resounded in an earthy chorus, and all the aches and bruises he had accumulated in the past few days lifted from him for a brief moment. He quickened his pace. A lithe silhouette crouched at the end of the hall. "Come." As he glanced ahead, he took note of the light gathering near the end of the corridor with the most intensity, but it was not the serene amber glow of the rock surface. Rather, it was a bright pale light which made him squint after so many hours of relative darkness. She had positioned herself near the center of a grand stone atrium, adorned with many runes and signs he could not understand. Within the atrium rested a single marble pedestal, and on that pedestal, a book. That central light shone down upon it, a single ray of blinding whiteness. Apprehension gripped him. It felt almost as if the room itself had been expecting someone. Kentucky waited until he had stepped up beside her, and they approached the atrium. Before it lay two long corridors reaching off into semi-darkness, adorned with similar tapestries. Together, they paused at the archway, and stared. There was no skylight in the round room, nor any flame to produce the light. The book looked as if it had lain there since the beginning of time. It simply was. "Maybe there's a map," said Ember, warily holding out a hand and waving it back and forth through the beam. "Or something that might tell us where to go from here." Kentucky edged closer, and Ember felt a chill as she slipped a finger into the crook of his elbow. He knew, simply from that cold, firm touch, that she was frightened. He had never seen her frightened before, or even thought it was possible for anything to frighten a siren. Hadn't she said herself that she was unafraid of magic? "There will be no map," she said stiffly. "We should at least take a look," he protested, feeling a twinge of impatience. "It seems to be a central room. Perhaps we can learn what happened here, or find a way out. It is useless, Kentucky insisted. It will bring us no good. We leave at once. But, her clawed finger dug into the soft part of his elbow and he choked on the words. Magic has clouded your mind, she hissed. I taste it. I smell it. Nothing good here. There was a sharp and demanding note to her voice that only furthered Ember's resolve. It was possible that had she not been so decisive, he might have conceded. There was a part of him that even agreed. But her obstinacy was reason enough to investigate. If she didn't want him to enter that room, he certainly would. No. I'm going to have a look. He wrenched his arm away and marched up the steps, advancing on the book and pedestal. She let him go but did not follow. As he entered, he glanced up at the ceiling. It was round, high, and curved into a dome. When he reached the book, he was greeted by empty pages. A delicate leather scrollwork decorated the edge, which he promptly ran his finger over, but it remained inanimate. Not one magical horror had leapt out at them since they passed through the door, something he half expected at every moment, but he had hoped something would happen. It did not seem to have suffered any damage, despite the carnage in the hall outside and its obvious age. Bemused, he hooked his thumb onto the cover to flip it closed in search of a title. Stuck. He pulled harder. It was like trying to pry a rock apart with his bare hands. Magic, Ember thought angrily, frowning down at the yellowed parchment. Kentucky was not going to help, far from it. Her mysterious attitudes grew more disconcerting at every turn, and he knew none of the rules of this place. Well, you're trapped here for now, and you can't simply wish yourself away. He clapped his hands and was amused to see Kentucky jump slightly in his periphery, but nothing revealed itself besides a puff of dust. Coughing, Ember fanned the air and squinted down at the blank pages, wondering how he could use it to his advantage. The door and the mountainside had required the truth of them. He spoke that truth again, stating his purpose there and adding a few lines about seeking a way out, but the only reply was a small echo. It tumbled out the doorway, creating myriad others as it went, and receded into unknown hallways and corridors. Leaning down, Ember blew some of the dust off the pages, and in so doing he accidentally brushed the upper corner of the left-hand page with his thumb. Something dark appeared and vanished like a wisp of black fog. He frowned, staring hard at the corner, and then ran his finger across it again. Bold calligraphic runes appeared briefly, as if summoned into being by his touch. Ember yanked his hand away and scrubbed it on his trousers, disturbed by the book's reaction to his fingerprint. He liked this magic even less, if possible, than the floating lights in the woods. At least those had seemed real to him at the time. At least they had substance. They were something. Something almost tangible, something which glowed and twinkled in the night. This new magic felt invasive, sinister, it sensed his touch. What else could the book discern from his presence there? Yet, at length, it seemed there was nothing better to be done, and Ember reluctantly traced his finger over the top line once more. Words appeared, "Speak aloud that we may know thine own heart's true intent, for within our sacred halls no man may speak a lie." Ember obliged, softly and haltingly reading the words aloud for Kentucky, and then moved on to the next line. "Welcome to our sacred halls, where is honored sacred thought, and be not wearied of thy stay, for here eternity is wrought." He paused, blinking. It was written in rhyme. Did that mean this was some sort of riddle? And who or what was welcoming them to the mountain? Knowledge here was treasured. His finger hovered over the word was, which overlapped here and treasured slightly, as if it had been corrected to something else by a careless writer. But in the very next moment the letters shifted, shrinking and elongating to make room for the little word. He widened his eyes, wondering if it was a trick of the light. With an effort of will, Ember kept his hand in place and swallowed, his throat scratchy from the dust. Whatever magic lingered here was actively trying to communicate. Something was changing the words as he read them. With that harrowing realization firmly in his mind, Ember continued to read aloud, slower than his usual halting cadence. Runes continued to shift under his fingers, but it happened too quickly for him to discern what they had been and speak them aloud instead. He was anxious to outwit whatever force was playing with the book, but never caught more than a few letters before they were switched around or promptly replaced. Knowledge here was treasured once, so shall ye faint what single quote ye sec. But be thou warned, lest ye despair, that too much knowledge harms the weak. Our holy writ has told of those who dwell below in waters deep. Ember glanced at Kentucky, but she stood motionless beneath the archway, black eyes fixed on the wall behind him. Accursed and stricken by their deeds, no sacred breath nor light to keep. Hold thee partake of human flesh and sup the blood of human veins, then be persuaded of thy past, that thou hast won these mortal pains. Stop. Ember leapt away from the pedestal, hand flying from the page, and whirled to face Kentucky. She now stared wild-eyed at the book, body quaking, one clawed finger pointing rigidly. Stop it, she hissed, her face white as birch bark. Read no further. Book of Echoes Part 2. The echoes of his voice quivered in the chamber, the word pens reverberating again and again. And then Ember realized with a start that the sentence were changing. Pains. 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 Plagues. 1,000. Plagues defile thy soul. Foul traitor. And devour thee whole. The vile words clamored about the atrium, gaining impetus as they were flung from pillar to pillar. It was Ember's voice, but something else was shaping it. Kentucky thrust her hands over her webbed ears and collapsed to one knee, gazing at the wall with empty eyes. Ember turned frantically to the book, slamming his hand on the pages with a breathless anger, but the words continued to crawl along beneath his fingertips and his own rogue voice continued to roll out the words in a blithe undertone. For though thine own black words denied the fate which moans through waters wide, hooray ye stand by for thy fault, as writ within this ancient vault. Snail skin, beware thy past and reckon with thine murderous deeds. Thou liest to the friend thou swore was single quote thicker than the water weeds. Blood for blood of brethren spilled we warned thee now he may decide, and in this act of venging flesh wold be forever justified. When he glanced down at Kentucky, 2 red streaks trailed from her lower eyelids to a finger's breadth above her jawline, like crimson tear trails. But they weren't tears. They were wounds. Dark, thick blood dripped the floor. Ember pounded his fist on the book until he bruised his own hand, but it had no effect on this adversary. He dared not approach Kentucky. If magic had hold of her, he didn't know what further harm might be done by interfering. Shut up! He shouted, scrabbling at the pages. That's my voice, and you can't have it. So we ask thee, friend or foe? Only truth and knowledge know. The echo slowly faded away, disappearing down the hall, and Kentucky collapsed in a heap on the floor. She shuddered, cupping her hands to her face. Blood dripped between her fingers and she released a muffled wail that shook him to the core, body and soul. Though the echoes were no more, the words which had been recited still hung thick in the air like a poisonous fog, whispering in Ember's mind. Instead of going to her at once, he remained standing near the pedestal, observing her with mingled suspicion and fear. The sirena trembled like a leaf, thin muscles taut beneath her jerkin as she stared down at the blood upon her fingertips. Crumpled. Submissive. It crushed his heart to see it, and moreover to know that he had begun to read those foul words, but the proclamations of the book filled him with a black, oozing dread. Kentucky? He whispered. Her only response was a faint whimper. Small and tremulous. She had never made such a sound before, and she did not look up. Hold thee partake of human flesh and sup the blood of human veins. Ember blinked down at the ruddy pool on the floor, numb with shock. He stepped down from the pedestal, his leather shoes silent on the stone, and got down on one knee beside Kentucky's shaking form. He held a hand over her shoulder. I'm sorry. He trailed off awkwardly. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I wouldn't have. The magic seemed to have released her from its thrall, and he was now anxious to leave. Please look at me, Kentucky, he begged, suddenly desperate. Kentucky, look at me. I'm sorry. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, round and dark. Something hazy swirled within them. Something different. Something a little softer than before. The book lied, didn't it? He whispered. You're not like them. Them. He remembered the skull with the pointed teeth. Remembered the way she had held it in her hands. Kentucky continued to gaze into his eyes, as silent as the cadavers they had passed by in the hall outside. The words he had read came back to him, for within our sacred halls no man may tell a lie. There was something Kentucky was hiding from him. Something she had been hiding since they spoke to the mountain's door, no, further back. Since their first encounter in the cabin. Perhaps if he pressured her now, the magic would force her to say it. It was a twisted inspiration, but what choice did he have? Are you? Ember hesitated for one moment, wary of her seductive presence, and then gently grasped her shoulder, shaking her a little. She swayed in his grasp like a river reed, but her pale lips tightened stubbornly. Why did you really bring me here, Kentucky? Her eyes darted here and there, everywhere except his face. Ember gritted his teeth, tasting dust. It wasn't just to read those runes, was it? He leaned forward, nose to nose with her, closer than he had dared before. At last she returned the stare, lower lip quivering once before pulling thin. Her skin felt cool and slippery against his, her eyes dark, soulless. They were so close he could see the two small lumps of her fangs hiding behind her lips, every slimy shimmer of her skin, every facet of her blackish-green irises, every gleam of her pupils, and he was certain she could hear his heart thudding in his chest. A drop of warm blood landed on his forearm. It smelled sweet, and sickened him. You, he muttered, his breath stirring the black locks of hair that hung down over her forehead. A few strands stuck to the slivered gashes. Blurry tears filled his eyes, but when he blinked them away she was still staring back at him as cold as ever. The emotion which crept over him was not sorrow. Wrath, hot and sticky, muddled his mind. You did lie to me, didn't you? He rubbed his thumb across her perpetually damp shoulder. Snail skin. I should have known better, Maker's breath, I'm such a fool. Who was it that you ate? The words began to lilt into an unfamiliar mirth, as if they no longer belonged to him. He felt detached from his own voice after listening to the echoes wander on without him. My sister? My father. Her silence was maddening. He wanted her to move. To speak. To confess. But she refused, her eyes shining like water. Go ahead, he panted, yanking his spear over his head. He gripped it tightly, stricken, the tip of it aimed at the Sirena's heart. Refute it. Tell me that was never your plan. Or kill me and eat me. What's stopping you now? Her eyelids twitched, nostrils flared. Why didn't she strike out? Or flee? Leave her, Ember. Leave her. She'll bring you to ruin, one way or another. He could not tell if those words were his own inner thoughts or another wayward echo. But he believed them. It had always been the truth, he had only been too blinded by her superficial charms to see her for what she really was. I trusted you, he tried. Nothing. Fear gripped him, threatening to turn the contents of his stomach inside out. Without her, he would be adrift in a sea of magic, looking for an exit which may not even exist. Go, Ember, the echoes whispered, pressing against him urgently. Go. He released his grip on her bare shoulder and crumpled his hand into a fist again. They stared at one another in silence. He understood now. Her presence was a poison, an addiction which kept him in thrall, even still. And then he stood to leave. Kentucky finally stirred, her delicate ears flickering slightly. The bat-like membranes folded inward with a shiver, half hidden in her hair. Ember flicked her blood from his arm. It smeared. She trembled beneath the archway, long limbs pressed against her body. Ungainly, grotesque, and startlingly beautiful. He wanted to say that he hoped he would never see her again, but his tongue froze to his teeth and he could not speak even a whisper. She was the only familiar thing he had left in this place. You're a fool, Ember, came the echoes. Get away while you can. The book shut with a thump and the light went out. Ember jumped in the sudden darkness, but the Sirena remained a slumped shadow near the entrance. He took several steps backwards into the hall, where the veins of living magic far above illuminated the cavern just faintly enough to see the great expanse stretching out before him. Kentucky huddled against the wall, her head bowed to her chest. Another drop fell from her cheek to her hands. It might have been a tear but for the darkness of the liquid. Ember hardened his heart, turned his back, and strode swiftly down the hall to the left, glancing over his shoulder to be sure she was not following. He was afraid, stripped of his wits, fearing her and loathing her at once. The echoes rolled endlessly in his mind, a dire warning. She never moved. And he left her there, alone with her blood in the book. Chapter 18 Wrath Reeking. Blood. The air reeked of blood. And magic. Thick, putrid magic. Ember's leather-clad footsteps echoed in the hall for several moments, and then she was alone. Alone in the dark, with no company but the lingering scent of his bitter fear sweat and the ebbing, flowing magic of that room. Kentucky gingerly touched the twin gashes. A pair of invisible claws had rent her face, from the ridge of her eyes to the root of her chin. The fluids which gave her life and breath were trickling forth unhindered. Curling her lip over a fang, she shifted her bleary gaze to the book. The book which lay so peacefully upon that marble pillar. Bad magic. She had told him it would bring them to harm, yet Ember would not listen to her. It was not like Ember to be enamored with anything other than her siren charms. The book was wicked. The book had taken Ember. And so, the book must die. It must be a sentient being to speak such clever words, and magic was considered to be alive in its own right. Thus, there was surely a way to make it suffer for what it had done to her, to them. The sting of Ember's words pricked her, again and again. Their truth held a torch to her watery soul and a fire to her damp, dark heart. No sooner had she extinguished it than it returned, and all the brighter. Squinting and blinking like a mole in broad daylight, Kentucky uncurled herself from her huddle on the stone and clenched both hands into fists, like Ember had. Rage was a foreign affliction for Kentucky. She was rarely driven to such unpleasant extremes. Fear, disgust, delight, contempt, curiosity. Those were her familiars. She had little concept of how to express rage. But that is what Ember did. Fist clench. He was angry with her. Very angry. Pursuing him would be of no use. He was certainly enchanted by the twisted spell song here, for she had given him no reasons to leave her all alone. She must order the book which had sent him away to fetch him back again. With silent steps, Kentucky ascended to the pedestal. Being shorter than Ember, she found it necessary to rise onto the tips of her toes to obtain a clear sight of her enemy. Through the haze of pain, she had glimpsed Ember struggling and failing to close the heavy book, before the magic enchanted him. Yet it slammed shut once he had spoken those festering words. She cowered within herself at the remembering of his eyes. No, must not think of that, and examined the magic-bound tome. Would it open again? I will make it. Hooking a finger beneath the leather binding, Kentucky gave it a savage yank. It was immobile. Hissing between her fangs and tasting blood on her lips, she wriggled her fingers between the pages, slowly, insidiously, like a starfish endeavoring to unhinge an oyster. Patience was often the key to success. For what seemed many hours, Kentucky persisted. She pried until her fingers ached, and tugged until her joints were stiff. When this did not avail her, she spat on the leather binding and hissed again. A drop of blood fell to the cover of the book. It sizzled like a burning coal and Kentucky leapt back, tumbling off the pillar and onto the cold stone floor. Soft laughter murmured around the room. A mere whisper at first, yet from that moment ever louder. Her own laughter. Lower in pitch, and more malicious. Just as Ember's voice was shaped by the wicked book, so her own echoes were captured and flung back to her. Sing for us, snail skin, and we will tell thee all ye wish to know. Kentucky remained very still, her eyes latched on the leather cover. She was not listening to the words. She was waiting. And then the book slammed open, pages flipping. Like a flash of lightning, Kentucky jumped up from her place on the floor and leapt not onto the base of the pillar but onto the stand itself, thrusting her hand into the swirl of pages and grabbing, twisting, tearing, ripping. With each brutal yank, runes flashed under her fingertips, but before they could form cohesive thoughts she had snatched the pages away. 8 pieces of torn paper were slashed from the leather book. She crumpled them in her fist, staring down at her prey with angry eyes. It could not bleed, but she could deform it, as it had deformed her. A whistling, inhuman shriek wailed around the cavern like 1,000 dying falcons, and Kentucky smiled tightly as the torn pages twitched and quivered, flipping as best they might in their ravaged state. Each time the book turned to a fresh, uncrumpled page, she reached down before it could summon more than 1 or 2 runes and indifferently plucked it from the binding, sparking another cascade of enraged whistles. "Sing for us! Sing for us!" the angry not her words commanded. "You take my dignity and my ember, foul remnant. I will not sing for you," Kentucky proclaimed, conscious that her voice was bereft of an echo. It had a pleasing flatness, she decided, and she would not let it unnerve her. "But you will tell me what I wish to know." The book hesitated before flipping another fresh, blank page. Kentucky blithely ripped it out from seam to seam, and raised her voice to be better heard over the irate screams. "I keep taking pages from this book until you do. There must be a secret to the workings of the book, as there was to all magical things. Kentucky supposed that it is not able to bite her face and bind her with invisible chains unless it knew of a similar punishment, perhaps written within that ledger long ago. She hoped very much that she had torn out those particular pages. "Yes," her echo relented finally. "Come down from thy perch, snail skin, and we shall tell thee all ye wish to know." Kentucky traced her finger across the ragged edges of the book and smirked, draping one elbow over her bent knees. No, she would not budge from her crouch on the pedestal. "I stay where I am, and you will still tell me all. Try your tricks once more, with the writings in this ledger, and I continue to pluck pages until none remain. Then you will be nothing. Nothing at all." The echoes wailed for a moment, chasing each other around the room before finally forming intelligible words. "Ssssss ye wish," they hissed, molding her voice into something truly savage. "As ye wish, snail skin. Ask us anything, and we will give to thee the truth and knowledge that ye seek." "I am in need of both," said Kentucky calmly, still tracing her finger around the defiled page. It shivered beneath her claw. "What have you done to Ember?" "Enlightened him," the echoes said smoothly. "We showed him what thou art, and thine own heart's true intent. That is knowledge. That is truth." "No," growled Kentucky, quashing the sting of those words as one might quash a bothersome fly between their fingers. "You sing only words which surely frighten him away. Half a truth is what men call deception, is it not?" More hisses filled the chamber, as if it were a pit of snakes. "Thou art liar, traitor, and thief. Man is soft of heart and doubtful of mind. It was easy to shatter his trust, snail skin. We know wherefore ye brought him here. We know, we know, we know." The voice rose into a shriek of laughter, and Kentucky snarled until it quieted. It knew. The book knew. She would pluck every page. She would tear it apart, tear it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter its pitiful remains to the savagery of an ocean storm. Pounding rain, frothing surf, and countless hungry sea-birds snapping at its pages. Yes. That would silence this book of stolen voices. The thought pleased her and she resumed her interrogation, somewhat mollified. "What manner of spell is he under?" "We are not so strong as ye believe," the echoes admitted, growing softer. "There is no spell but that of his own weak mind. And so shall we beguile thee." "Lies," Kentucky snapped. "I know what you are. This fish will never swim into your net." The echoes laughed again. Mournful, dark. "Oh, but ye have. And ye shall never get out, little fish. Never, 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 never. Mankind loathes thee. Mankind fears thee. The man who has left thee is desirous of thy death. Thou art defenseless in our halls. The door is shut behind thee." "Stop speaking," Kentucky said, digging her claws into the few perfect pages that remained and tightening her lips. Something inside of her yearned to hear more. Her own voice, the voice of a sirena, had enchantments of its own, and she was now frightened of being swayed by her own simple magic. A drop of blood splattered on the paper with a sizzle of smoke. She didn't move as the heat seared her skin. "Stop speaking or I will gut you like the fish you describe." "Two entered our kingdom together," the echoes continued in a moaning wail. "Now thou art twain asunder. The one called Ember hates ye. Should ye not hate him in turn? If he finds thee again, he will not be the same. Not the same. No, not him. Kentucky bared her fangs and dug her claws into the paper. There was a brief screech that died away quickly as she hesitated. You do not have him anymore. He is mine before he is yours, she couldn't help adding smugly. Ah, but there are other forces lurking here within our sacred halls. Be afraid, little fish. Be afraid. Be afraid? Kentucky murmured. She did not like those words, but they seemed somehow reasonable. She should be afraid, but not afraid of Ember. Afraid of the book. Stop speaking, she repeated more slowly, curling her fingers, or I will do away with you. But we are not finished. No, not yet, whispered the echoes. We know why thou art here. We know what ye came for. But he shall never return to thee now, little fish. Ye must seek him out. Kentucky tried to respond, but her shoulder ached where Ember had grabbed her, and she shivered her skin, trying to think past the fog. Seek him out. And end him, quick. Before the man kills thee. End Ember? The words slipped from Kentucky's lips in a desperate sigh. I cannot. Thou hast killed before, her own echo whispered back to her. It brought her comfort. A guiding voice. Thou hast souped the human blood. To whom dost thou belong? To the man, who now hates thy bones, or to thyself? Kentucky squinted, and then shut her eyes for a moment. The thought was backwards. Twisted. Upside down. But at the moment, she could not place her finger on it. It was elusive as a prawn in murky waters. Nevertheless, something was strange about this reasoning. Thou art a dweller of the dark and the deep, coaxed the voice. He has nowhere to run. A little thrill tickled Kentucky's spine like a scuttling spider, and her focus quickly shifted from the question of killing Ember to the question of the hunt. Too much murmuring magic here, she murmured, glaring down at the book. She thoughtfully stabbed a claw through one of the last remaining pages, savoring its annoyed squeal. Too much magic. He can hide from me. Sing, urged the echoes. Sing for the man, and he must come. It was very wrong to use those words in that way, but Kentucky was finding it difficult to think any more in reasons, and finally abandoned her own faculties for this new logic which had been presented to counter the problem of Ember. Hunt, kill, devour. So simple. I cannot sing, she conceded slowly, still caught in the fear that something terrible might happen if she but lifted her voice in song, but I can hunt. Go, urged the echoes. Find Ember. Find Ember. Kentucky dropped from the pedestal and landed in a crouch on all fours. She spread her sticky fingers across the tiles, sensing the dusty footprints where he had once stood. His scent was unmistakable, bitter and salty, musky and sweet, with a whisper of pine and old leather. That combination of smells, familiar and intriguing, was Ember. His scent and the scent of her blood. Two things that should never have been together. And he had left her. Kentucky licked her fangs, feeling the prick of each tooth and tasting the air with her tongue. Find Ember. All else faded. Springing up onto her feet, Kentucky left the chamber and the echoes behind and set off down the hall, looking neither right nor left nor up at the glowing roof above her head. She only knew that there was enough light to see by and plenty of darkness to hide in. Find Ember. Kentucky smiled, and fresh blood trickled slowly down her jaw. She would find him. Oh yes, she would find him. Nowhere to run. Chapter 19 Reflection. Ember slowed, each step heavier than the last, blankly watching the stone tiles beneath his feet and brushing his hand across the columns as he passed. Each column the same, every hall filled with dust and the dead. Dirt, mold, decay, endless corridors which only led to other endless corridors. Time had no meaning in the endless night of the mountain. When the glow which filtered down from above grew dim and swallowed up the pillars in shadow, Ember held out the stone light and it brightened his path enough to keep from smacking into a wall. The tapestries were taller than the greatest and oldest of trees in the forest below. Some of them were torn, and a few hung low enough to touch. Gold embroidery and faded colors had somehow survived the centuries, and now and then he thought one of the designs curled in a little tighter at his passing, or a woven figure looked away as he glanced up. He was wandering through a mountain. A mountain. That much he remembered. How he had gotten here was a mystery, but he did not belong in these echoing chambers. Many great rooms were locked, and those that were open seemed in disarray, solid oaken doors, glossy and petrified, hanging off their hinges. Splintered furniture. Shattered cutlery. Occasionally a weapon or a stack of broken items which might once have serviced as a barricade. One such room appeared to have been a dining hall, long and dark with many tattered banners hanging about. It was mostly taken over by creeping vines and moss, and a smattering of luminous berries. He plucked one, and it went dark in his hand. It smelled rather foul, and the temptation to eat it faded quickly. Shattered dishes crunched under his shoes. Ember wandered the room, running a finger along the table and watching the polished wood appear through the filth in a little trail. He had not encountered a body in a long while, but there were several here, the most notable of which sat at the head of the table in a tall, carven chair. The rest of the party had been desecrated. Picked clean. But not him. Perhaps some sort of protective enchantment? What do you know, Ember? What do you know about such things? Nothing, that's what. Ember glanced at the desiccated corpse quickly before turning away. He did not like that forever grinning face. Off the dining hall was a larder. No doubt fully stocked at one time, it now contained many empty and broken baskets and jars. He found this room the most disappointing of them all, for the berries had made him aware of how hungry he had become. And then it was back to the main hall, which he hoped would lead to somewhere of importance if he continued to follow it. He knew he would never find his way out by turning around and going back, and besides, if he did chance upon that hall again it would be sheer happenstance. "I have to get out," he murmured aloud, curling his fingers around the wooden spear. He didn't know where he had found it. He only knew that it was his. His voice lingered and his own echo was unreasonably satisfying. It belonged to him, like the spear. Why had he come to such a forsaken place, anyway? He couldn't recall. It must have been the creature. What was her name? Kentucky. Kentucky had tricked him into coming here. She had meant to lose him in these winding halls all along. Yes, that must have been her plan. But why had he agreed to go with her in the first place? I have to think, I have to remember. Ember brushed a cobweb from his eyes and sighed, stopping in the middle of the hallway. Footsteps whispered on behind him for a moment more, and then paused. A prickling sensation touched the back of Ember's neck. More magic? He rested the spear in the crook of his elbow for a moment and clapped his hands, listening to the echoes rattle away into the darkness. No. The sounds rolled on before him. Ember held his breath, his tongue lodging in the back of his throat, and hesitated. He dared not speculate, could scarcely move, but the last thing he wanted to do was turn around and see it lurking there. Nevertheless, he counted silently to 3, gripping his spear very tightly. On the third count, he spun on his heels, eyes wide to behold whatever monstrosity haunted his steps. His heart skipped a beat and all his strength flooded out through the soles of his feet, rooting him to the floor. Ebony pupils glowered back at him. His fishing spear had come to rest a finger's breadth from Kentucky's breastbone, and her silent breath chilled his face. The bloody wounds pulled white as she smiled. Her stare was empty. Ember twitched backward. Kentucky. Her ears twitched forward and she grinned, neck elongating, mouth gaping. He glimpsed her tongue as it curled behind her pearlescent fangs, a bluish-pink flash of moist skin. It was the most macabre smile Ember had ever witnessed. His hand spasmed. He would shove the spear. He would do it now. But it never moved. It remained a fixture between them, still and useless. A flash of clarity broke through the lingering scarlet rage in his mind, a cool swath of green that quieted his jumbled emotions and brought with it a deluge of recent memories. The door. The book. The echo. You lied to me. And he left her there. Alone. With the book. Some way, somehow, it all circled back to the book. He hated the memory of it, the words which had hurt Kentucky Vlee and made her bleed. And then he remembered grabbing her, shaking her, threatening her with his spear. With each new memory he flinched. The sirena watched him, her eyes glimmering like black marbles in the dark. The corners of her mouth turned down and he could see her gums. Then, quick as a frog's tongue, her arm shot out and she snatched the spear, twisting, pulling. It was wrenched from him with petrifying ease. Flung aside. The wooden spear clattered into the darkness. And then she lunged. The memories fled, leaving behind only raw instinct and gut terror. Claws hooked on the edge of his sleeve, tearing through the material as Ember twisted away and sprinted down the hall. He could not kill her, but he could run. Both arms pumping, head pounding, heart thumping, and behind him came a blood-chilling shriek that set his nerves on fire. The demon in the dark was upon him. A familiar demon. It knew him, and he knew it. The hall blurred around him as he ran and he could scarcely make out a dark shape looming ahead. If he darted around it, she would be on top of him. Before he could decide what to do, he was suddenly plunged into darkness, smothered by something coarse and soft. He panicked and pushed past it, wrestling with the dusty fabric. It gave way to a frantic tug and one of the tapestries ripped from the ceiling, tumbling down around his shoulders. It was heavy. He panted, struggling out of it before it enveloped him. From behind him came another wicked scream, and a sound like a flock of dying birds as the falling fabric was torn to shreds. If he hadn't chanced to see a glimmer of light reflecting off a shiny surface, a glass pane of some sort, he would have run directly into the wall. As it was, he banked sharply to the right and noticed a faint glow at the end of this new tunnel. Light. Light was his only chance. He could not hide from her in the dark, and though he was broader and his strides far longer, he knew she was gaining ground. The tapestry had given him a slight advantage, as had the rush of fear, but he could feel her drawing near, hear the pat of her bare feet on the floor. As he ran, the light grew stronger. At times he caught glimpses of someone running along beside him, just a flash, a shadow, and after this happened twice he realized there were mirrors hanging along the hallway at regular intervals. Run faster. His legs burned. The mirrors became more frequent, growing in size until they stretched from floor to ceiling and went on as far as the doorway ahead of him. A frantic sideways glance lent him a sense of urgency and a speed he had not known he possessed. Kentucky sprinted less than 2 paces behind him, matching his long legs stride for stride, black hair streaming behind her. One false foot and she would be on top of him. The mirrors were all around them, up and down, the ceiling, the tiles, every surface reflected his wide eyes, gaping mouth, and disheveled mess of blonde curls, and behind him. A cold breath stung his ear. Ember stumbled. His shirt choked him, the cloth ripping in the back and claws digging into his spine, dragging furrows through his bare muscles. He felt 1,000 tiny tugs as the tendons tore. No. Ember shouted, his voice magnified in the hall as he lurched forward, desperate to yank himself free. The claws separated from his skin. He fell. The instant his knees touched ground he threw his arms over his head and curled into a tight ball on the mirrored tiles, blood leaking down his sides. And he braced himself for the searing pain of being divided from his flesh by a creature of the deep. A rush of wind, and a shadow, and then the patter of feet on the opposite side of his head. Ember buried his face in his arms, holding his breath until he was certain his lungs would explode. His body ached for air, but he could not give in. The silence was so long and so dark that at last he dared to open his eyes and slowly, lift his head. The Sirena had surrounded him. Black eyes glared from every facet of the hall, fangs glistened on every mirrored surface, her lithe form crouched behind every corner. And yet she remained curiously silent. Not a single hiss slipped past her fangs. Ember waited. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Her delicate nostrils flared at the corners and her upper lip curled out slightly. Those black pitted eyes darted to the left. To the right. Then through him once again. Ember let out his breath very slowly, careful to make no noise at all. Her left ear shivered and she spread her fingers and toes lightly across the mirrors, lean muscles coiling. There was only one explanation, which came to him with startling relief. He was invisible. Whether by some strange enchantment or a trick of the steady light in the mirrors, he could see her, he could see hundreds of her, but she could not see even one of him. Her many eyes scoured the hall and she growled low in her throat. Ember. She gurgled at long last, a gruesome lullaby. Ember. 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 He shut his eyes for a moment, swallowing once. The blithe undertones dragged at him, pulled at every fiber of his being. Ember. 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 Ember continued breathing, very slowly, in and out with the utmost silence, in an attempt to calm his racing heart. Could she hear a thudding? Blood crawled across the fabric of his shirt, pooling in the valley of his spine and the hollow of his lower back. He felt like fainting, but it would be the death of him if he did. Instead, he put his tongue between his teeth to keep them from shaking together and glanced around at all the 1,000 eyes which peered back at him. And then, plop. Ember froze. The eyes blinked. Plop. His blood was dripping. She snuffled, and a fierce white gleam lit up all the eyes around the hall. Her lips curled back in a thin grin of triumph as she slunk forward. Plop. Each Kentucky advanced with the same stealth, the same cunning smile, the same wide-eyed stare. Ember quaked. He had to decide which was the true threat, and quickly. Her chin lifted and she put out her tongue, tasting the air. He tensed, torn muscles knotting, and rose to a half-crouch. Grasped the hilt of the knife he had stuffed under his belt. 3 more drops of blood spattered the mirror beneath him. He drew the knife forward. Their eyes met. She had found him, somehow, in the sea of reflections. The knife felt heavy in his hand. His fingers curled around it, smeared and shaking. His gaze left hers as he followed the row of mirrors until he stared down what he hoped was the correct tunnel, and not merely another illusion. The hall wound on in a series of confusing mirrors, but from where he was crouching he could see a warping of the light at the far end. A stone door. Was it, too, a reflection? He tried to force strength back into his limbs, but all he had left was a little willpower. It would have to suffice. She advanced another step, her 1,000 fingers delicately webbed on the bridges of her 1,000 noses creasing around her 1,000 eyes. Her shoulders hunched and she bared her fangs in an obscene grimace. A clawed hand reached, fingers curling, tongue protruding, eyes wild, closing in from every possible angle. Now. Ember shot forward like a pebble from a sling, slipping once on the slick pool of blood, and turned his focus entirely upon the distant door. He collided with something soft, there was a thump and his shoulder burned like fire, but he shoved past, sprinting for the end of the hall. A dreadful keening wail shivered the air behind him, rising to a pitch beyond his range of hearing. His ears rang and tears of pain welled in his eyes at the deafening shriek. The mirrors shattered. Shards of glass crumbled to the ground, pelting off his shoulders, and the glassy tiles cracked and split into fragments beneath his leather shoes. He heard a savage snarl behind him, and a rhythmic thumping. No effort to soften her sticky footsteps, the game was over. The door now loomed ahead of him, a great monolith of grayish stone, chiseled and coarse. He was almost there. 5 more leaps. 3 more. 1. Ember's palms smashed into the stone with a staggered thud. It didn't move. He rammed his shoulder into the door with a rasping yell of effort. His eyes watered. Blood ran across the stone. "Please," he panted, pounding on the ancient door until his knuckles split. "Open. Please." A terrible shriek clawed the air. "Let me in." Ember screamed, his voice tearing in his throat. The ground trembled. Bits of rock crumbled under his fingertips, and then the door swung slowly inward, grating across the floor like a mortar and pestle. Light spilled out, some of it warm as candlelight and some of it pale as the light of day. Ember pressed himself against the cleft. He had to squeeze through. He risked a quick glance over his shoulder. She was further behind than he had thought, but gaining 3 strides to each one he had taken. Broken glass flashed beneath her bare feet. With a final shove, Ember squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling onto mossy stone. He glimpsed a single stream flowing through the center of the room, flanked by rivergrass springing up out of the tiles and endless stacks of books against every wall. Candles flickered to life beneath his hurried glance, and a steady ray of daylight spilled over the stream and the misplaced greenery. To his horror, the door continued to open behind him. "Close, close, close," he shouted, backing away. He clenched the knife in a shaking hand, panting, breathless. A grinding sound rang in his teeth as the door obediently reversed its deadly course, swinging shut again with that same terrifying slowness. He could see her coming. Flying over the ground in leaps and bounds, a black shadow among the fragments of the mirrors. The door was almost shut. She flung herself at the gap. With a scrape and a boom, the stone shuddered into place. Something thudded against the door from the outside and a warbling howl of rage froze his bones. It died away into a single mournful echo, and Ember slowly lowered the knife, drawing a deep breath and choking as his ribs expanded, stretching the ragged wounds across his back. Ember, son of Jarrell, lived a fool, and died a fool. This was the end. The end of them both. Hello. Ember whirled around, putting out a hand for balance with a cry of surprise and pain. The room continued to spin around him and he sank to one knee. Through the blur, a figure stood nearby. Just beyond the flowing water, clothed all in white. A woman. The tall maiden stepped forward, lacing her fingers, and smiled. Fairy hair spilled over her shoulder, reaching the floor in soft flaxen waves. How goes the war? He reached for a handhold and, finding none, mouthed empty words. Nothing escaped him but a gut-twisting moan. The knife slipped from his fingers and he slumped to the tiles. Those ransacked bookshelves and that crystalline stream faded from his view as he surrendered himself to the blackness. A sense of tremendous relief overwhelmed him. The pain faded, his forehead touched the cold stone floor, and his back spasmed once more before going numb. It was all just a dream. He would awaken soon, surely, upon his heather mattress, tucked beneath a ragged old blanket as he listened to the rustle of wind in the pines and the consolatory rush of the river as it wended past his cozy cabin. Safe. And alone. Chapter 20 Lady of the Oracle. Ember came to consciousness with his face smashed into cold damp stone, a dreadful crick in his neck, and soft light flickering against the backs of his eyelids. When he shifted an elbow to prop himself up, his back split open and fresh blood oozed from the wounds. His skin felt feverish, and there was no strength left in his body with which to tend his wounds. All the nitbun in the world wouldn't help him now. Gritting his teeth and sucking in a shallow breath, Ember decided to remain on the floor for the time being. He cracked one eye and noticed a few nearby candles tucked under a ledge, their flames wavering gently when he inhaled and exhaled. The daylight he thought he had seen was gone, but he could make out a few crystal rocks jutting out of the ground in the walls, translucent under the light of the candles. The tiny glimmering wicks dotted every alcove, a few resting atop stacks of yellowed books, growing ever smaller and twinklier as they receded up a flight of stone steps at the end of the room. And he could hear the stream flowing nearby. It was almost pleasant. Almost. He lay there quietly for several minutes, remembering everything. Where had the woman gone off to? Had she really been there at all, or had he imagined her standing beyond the stream, a spirit in white? Surely he couldn't imagine such a vision on his own, not even if he tried. Licking his lips, Ember lifted his head from the flagstones. Slowly. Very slowly. His tongue was swollen, the corners of his mouth cracked from thirst, and the stream was just a few paces away. If he moved carefully, he might be able to reach it without— Confound it all. Ember swore and threw himself headlong across the mossy stones, his hands splashing into the water. Wait. He froze, fingers scarcely wetting his lips. The woman knelt directly before him, on one knee in the middle of the stream. A pale and luminous hand reached toward his face in warning. "Do not drink from the stream," she whispered. "It is poisoned." Ember dropped his hands and sank to his elbows, lips parted in silent shock. She smiled. "I believe you will find what you desire." There. Her hand shifted and she uncurled a single finger, pointing somewhere behind his head. He turned with a groan, but saw only candles and the flower-like crystals rooted in the wall and nearby flagstones. Now that his ears had stopped ringing, he heard something new and soft. Ember listened for several seconds before realizing it was a melody. The shifts in tone were so subtle he could barely follow the notes, and it was coming from all around, it seemed. Perhaps the crystals. Don't be ridiculous. Yet, somehow, it seemed oddly fitting. There were thousands of sparkling crystals of many shapes and colors, adorning the walls and protruding from the ground where the flagstones touched the natural rock. Some were massive, the length of his lower arm and twice as broad, with other smaller crystals branching off near the base, and others were very small by comparison. A few grew among the ordinary-looking foliage near the stream. He dragged himself sideways across the floor, crying out in pain as the muscles across his back stretched and tore open. Each tiny flinch brought back the sensation of her claws digging into his flesh as clearly as if she were tearing into him at that very moment. Blood dripped onto the flagstones. He reached out, utterly spent, fingers brushing one of the crystals, and the moment he connected with the stone, a sweet song filled the air like the trembling notes of a little bird in the forest. He took his hand away and it was immediately silenced. There was no echo. Ember shivered. The pain was a little less. That faint tingle of relief was enough to touch the crystal again, and this time he eagerly dug his fingers into the surrounding stone with a sort of hungry franticness. The taste of healing was too much. He needed the pain to end, and he needed it to end now. Euphoria overwhelmed him as the floor crumbled easily under his fingertips and the many-faceted crystal fell into his palms. He clutched it tightly, savoring the relief that coursed through his veins. The surface was clear, shot through with hues of coral and purple, and when he held it up to the nearest candle he saw the misty colors shifting to and fro like the eddying clouds of a tiny thunderstorm, trapped within a glassy stronghold. It reminded him, abstractly, of the stone he had hidden under his shirt. It shimmered in his hands. He waited with bated breath. Then it began to dissolve, melting over his fingertips and sending streaks of purple and coral dust swirling up his skin. It was a strange sensation, like cool honey being poured over his head, or being submerged in a stream comprised mainly of bubbles, and somehow not at all unpleasant. When the crystal was entirely dissolved and the dancing colors faded to nothing, leaving behind only grime and flecks of gore on his skin, Ember gratefully sat up straight and ran his hands through his tangled curls, drawing deep, effortless, grateful breaths and closing his eyes for a moment. Thank the Maker. Now that the pain had fled his body, he observed another pain, this one very deep inside his chest. He swallowed, blinking away all recent memories, and put 2 fingers against his collarbone where a noticeable lump stuck in his throat. The sudden relief had given him enough mental clarity to focus again, and he chose to redirect his attention to the nature of his surroundings rather than dwelling upon the unhappy circumstances which had brought him to this place. He dug his fingers into one of the larger gems on the floor, curious, but the rock around it remained immovable and the crystal itself was dark and unfriendly. They know. He glanced up and saw the lady in white still standing in the middle of the stream. She was leaning forward to look down at him, her long hair brushing the stone tiles. She was smiling again. Ember slowly removed his hand, glancing helplessly at his knife. It lay beside the door where he had dropped it, too far away to be of immediate use. You have no need of further assistance, she explained, reaching out to touch him on the shoulder. The crystals know. He leaned away, scowling in suspicion. Are you thirsty? He was indeed parched and famished, but remembered all too well the twisted advice of the book, and held his tongue. If you thirst, she said, her tone somehow both soothing and authoritative, follow. She drifted between the twinkling candles and the crystals, her lengthy skirt trailing behind like a glowing waterfall. The current seemed to drag at the hem of her dress, but there was something unnatural about her silent footsteps and sudden appearances which made him wonder. He glanced to his left and realized that the stream was sourced from a darkened alcove at the end of the long room, and flowed between the steps. Licking his lips, Ember glanced upward. He was surprised to see that the cavern narrowed to an opening far, far above him. The room itself seemed to be a naturally fashioned hollow or a crag which had previously existed within the mountain. Crystals lined the rocky walls nearer the bottom, growing in an upward direction as if drawn to the natural light, and he could even make out a few stars in the inky sky. Ember held his breath for a moment, captivated. So close, so tangible, and yet so far away. And even could he scale those heights, stumbling back down the mountain would mean certain death as well. He could never do it alone. Not without her. Who poisoned it? He croaked, swallowing again. The lady had paused in a doorway framed by twisted wood, the only room he could see from his vantage point. The door itself was slightly ajar, and looked as if it had remained so for many years, for much foliage had grown over it. Thick green vines trailed out of the room in a carefree tangle, broad white flowers with pink and purple throats spilling over to shallow steps and the flagstones below. She was still smiling. "Did you not seek refuge from one such assailant?" Instead of answering, Ember stepped across the floor and grasped the knife, adjusting his fingers around the handle until it felt secure in his palm, and weighed his options. He certainly wasn't going back to the Hall of Mirrors at the moment, and this woman seemed to be hinting at fresh water further in. In the end, it was his own thirst which drove him onward. He took 2 steps, watching her closely. Her blue eyes glowed in the mingled light of the candles and the stars, so different from the Sirena's pitted glare. And she smiled at him again. A smile of encouragement, he thought. It made him feel slightly less disturbed, in spite of himself. "Come and drink." That was all Ember needed to hear. He splashed through the stream and hopped up both steps at once, pushing his way inside. Vines enveloped him, soft and smelling of spring, but he brushed them out of the way until he could see the light of a few candles within. A small room had been hewn from the surrounding stone. In one corner sat a pristine bed with a frame of the same twisted wood as the doorway, neatly adorned with startlingly white linens. A wooden trapdoor which featured a small handle rested on the ground behind the entrance. Its purpose was not difficult to guess at, and he made note of it in case he should need to use it later. In the corner opposite the bed sat a single wooden stand, and on it a wash basin. And a pitcher. He hurried toward it, stuffed the knife under his belt, clamped both hands around its cool glazed finish, and held it up to his mouth, empty. He glanced at the basin. Also empty. Stricken, Ember whirled around and thrust the pitcher at the woman, shaking it violently. "You said there would be water." He tried to shout, but his voice cracked and it came out in a hoarse whisper. "Where is the water?" "It is in your hands. You have only to pour it into the basin." Lady of the Oracle Part 2. He stared at her, chest heaving. "Look into the basin," the lady urged him. Ember had no choice but to glance desperately into the bottom of the bowl. Human runes had been etched into the mottled blue stone, "Receive." He frowned, glancing into the pitcher, but it was still empty. He grasped the handle and tilted it toward the candle light, squinting down into its glazed interior. The inside was perfectly smooth without a hint of a rune. Then his finger brushed a ridge along the outside, opposite the handle. He flipped it over. More runes had been carved into the side of the pitcher. "Ask." Ember growled, feeling tricked. Yet the basin lay before him, too tempting to ignore. What if it's more bad magic, like the book? The promise of those shimmering runes was improbable, at best. But it didn't seem more improbable than anything else which had happened to them, no, them alone, now, in these treacherous halls. "Water?" he rasped, tilting the pitcher. He didn't know what would happen, and he certainly believed that something would happen. There was too much magic in the air for nothing strange to occur here. A shiver ran through him from head to toe at the first blink of water hitting the glaze. He filled it as full as he could stand before setting down the pitcher with a thump and lifting the basin, taking 5 deep draughts of dusty water. When he was finished, he snatched up the pitcher and poured some more. He did this 3 times until he was completely sated. "Hungry?" He slowly lowered the bowl, peering at the lady over the rim of it. She swayed in the door, smiling at him. Did she never stop smiling? Who was she, anyway? He was, in truth, afraid to ask. "A little," he confessed, wiping his mouth on his sleeve and grimacing as bits of dried blood clung to his skin. She moved into the room and he backed away, feeling cornered. Both elegant hands reached out to cradle one of the vines that branched along the wall, which had grown into a veritable bush. Something hung between her glowing fingers, and under the light of her touch Ember realized that it was a small pear-shaped fruit. "Eat this." He cleared his throat, setting down the basin and eyeing her from his corner. "What is it?" "The oracle's fruit," she said, as if that should have been obvious. "It is his room in which you stand, and his water from which you drank." "Won't he mind?" "Not at all." This is a sanctuary. You are free to eat and drink of our fruit and water as much as you please, as are all who come here seeking refuge." She petted the fruit with her fingers, and he noticed that none of the vines or the leaves moved under her touch. "Come and eat." He crossed the room slowly, but she made no move to harm him. "How many people have passed through here?" "Hundreds," she said. "But you are the first in many days." "I can't say I'm surprised." He plucked the fruit, enjoying the smooth feeling of it in his hand for a moment, and then took a bite. Mingled flavors burst on his tongue, both tart and sweet, and a bit of juice dribbled down his chin. Are you satisfied?" "Well, if I die," he declared around a full mouth, "at least I didn't die hungry." He stopped chewing as she let out a gentle laugh. "What are you laughing at?" "That you would perish, eating the fruit of the oracle." She blinked once, still smiling. "That is a funny thing to say." "Not when the water's been poisoned," he said, indignant. But he finished the fruit, plucked another, and ate it as well. When he was through, the lady drifted back to the doorway. "You may rest here as long as you wish," she offered, trailing down the steps and out of view. Ember hurried after her, suddenly not wanting to be left alone in the dark. "Wait, he wavered on the stoop. The lady was nowhere to be seen. "Hello." He stepped down onto the flagstones, slowly, and shivered, pacing along the stream. The candles flickered from every ledge and he sidestepped a pile of books. He had no desire to touch those. The black alcove at the top of the stairs was the only place she might have gone. Ember withdrew the stone from his torn shirt, blowing on it, but it remained numb despite his best efforts. He tucked it away again and glanced at one of the candles. He cautiously placed a finger to the wax, but it was cool to the touch. Nor had any wax dripped down from the wick. He half expected it to bring a curse upon his head, and cringed as he retrieved it from the flagstone, but nothing happened. Holding it out to light the way, Ember ventured up the first of the steps, glancing first down at the water which sparkled beside his shoes. The candle's flame provided just enough light to reveal a circular stone structure at the top of the stairs, near the center of the alcove. As he advanced, it took shape before him, a well. Yawning wide and blinking away tears of exhaustion, he dragged himself up the last few steps, pulled by a relentless curiosity. He stared down into the water and scrubbed a hand across his face, watching it flow through a gap in the carved stones and trickle down the steps. At the opposite end of the room it flowed out under the wall, but it wasn't nearly large enough for him to fit through. Neither did there appear to be a door in this alcove. Only the well. He held the candle a bit closer, leaning down and peering into its depths. A glistening, reflective surface lay beneath him, as still as the mirrors outside. It was impossible to guess how deep the cistern went, but he studied his reflection for a moment, startled at how odd he looked in the flickering light. Deep hollows ringed his eyes, as if he had not slept in weeks, and dried blood speckled one side of his face. His hair was a nest of tangles and dirt, and the stubble he usually shaved away for the sake of his pride had reappeared. It added nothing of benefit to his disheveled appearance. "No one may see into the well," came a gentle voice from the door. He spun around, but the oracle. "You are not the oracle." Ember glared flatly at the woman, holding up the candle in a shaking hand. "What do you mean? What am I not seeing?" "The past, the present. Rarely the future." She tilted her head, her impossibly long hair shifting over her shoulder. It was then that he noticed how tall she was, not a giant, by any means, but taller than Ember, and none of the women in the village had been taller than he. The well whispers, and the oracle hears. He turned his tired glare to the well. "I'd like to know how to get out of here." "Could it tell me that?" "It could. But you are not the oracle. Maybe, if it's not too much trouble, you can tell this oracle that I require his services." "Impossible." "Why?" She pointed, and Ember held the candle toward the darkened corner of the alcove opposite the well. A skeletal figure slumped against the mossy wall, and in spite of how many bodies he had encountered, it was enough to startle Ember. Most of the raiment had mildewed or been carried away by little rodents. Nothing was left but the bones. "Oh." He swallowed tightly. "Can you make it talk?" "The well speaks to the oracle." "You said that already." Ember touched a finger to the hewn stone. "Well of the oracle, show me how to get out of this mountain." He lowered the candle almost to the water's surface, leaning as close as he dared, but only his own face glared back at him, haggard and pale. "Help me," he tried again, too tired to speak above a whisper. "How do I get out of here?" The candle flickered under his breath, but the water remained unmoved. Ember opened his mouth to ask the lady if she might try for his sake, but the alcove steps had lapsed into shadows and his strange hostess was nowhere to be seen. He sighed and headed back to the little bedroom, each step heavy and slow. A quick glance around the sanctuary revealed no trace of her flaxen hair or luminous attire. "Fine," he thought bitterly, reaching the 2 flat steps and ascending them for a second time. "Hide yourself then." He brushed the trailing vines aside and set the candle on the stand beside the basin. Then he removed the stone from his shirt and set it beside the candle. It glowed dimly, and he knew if the siren were there she could bring it back to life with a single breath. Groaning, he pulled back the linens and crawled into bed. His battered body relaxed at once and he inhaled deeply several times, grateful for the comforting embrace of the linens. The mattress was not prickly or overstuffed, and he caught a scent of dried flower petals and sage as he sank into its welcoming embrace. As he stretched, a peculiar tightness beset his back, and when he slipped a hand behind his shoulder he noticed a thin depression and bump under his fingertips. He explored further, and encountered several more scars. Ember curiously unwrapped the makeshift bandage from his lower arm, which had remained there since he had applied the nitbran, and swept away the drying leaves. A quick touch revealed a few faint blemishes further up his arm, near the crook of his elbow. The crystals hadn't taken away the sirena's marks, only healed them insofar as they caused him no further pain. He wrinkled his forehead, dismayed, but quickly decided that it didn't matter as long as he was no longer tormented by them. As Ember reclined, arms tucked comfortably behind his head, he noticed that this room also reached to the open sky. Only a narrow gap could be seen, enough to glimpse a few stars. It must be enchanted somehow, he decided. Elsewise, rain and unwanted guests from above would surely have brought the place to ruin. There were too many books strewn about not to have taken some precautions against the elements. Oracle, thought Ember, tugging the blankets under his chin. Strange name. Whoever he was, he must have been a great lover of books. Despite the fatigue, it was impossible to quiet his mind. For when he drifted close to dreams, he remembered the dark-haired Sirena, her ink-blood eyes and predatory smile haunted him without mercy. First she had 2 fangs, then 4, then 10, and then there was nothing but the fangs and a gaping, drooling grin. Thus, though the passing night felt like an eternity, his sleep was far from restful and he awoke many times in a cold sweat. As the sky grew faintly brighter, he found himself unable to return to his slumber. Instead, he stared up at the hollow sky far above him, and watched the stars sail over the mountain. Lady of the Oracle Part 2. He stared at her, chest heaving. "Look into the basin," the lady urged him. Ember had no choice but to glance desperately into the bottom of the bowl. Human runes had been etched into the mottled blue stone. Receive. He frowned, glancing into the pitcher, but it was still empty. He grasped the handle and tilted it toward the candle light, squinting down into its glazed interior. The inside was perfectly smooth without a hint of a rune. Then his finger brushed a ridge along the outside, opposite the handle. He flipped it over. More runes had been carved into the side of the pitcher. Ask. Ember growled, feeling tricked. Yet the basin lay before him, too tempting to ignore. What if it's more bad magic, like the book? The promise of those shimmering runes was improbable, at best. But it didn't seem more improbable than anything else which had happened to them, no, them alone, now, in these treacherous halls. "Water?" he rasped, tilting the pitcher. He didn't know what would happen, and he certainly believed that something would happen. There was too much magic in the air for nothing strange to occur here. A shiver ran through him from head to toe at the first blink of water hitting the glaze. He filled it as full as he could stand before setting down the pitcher with a thump and lifting the basin, taking 5 deep draughts of dusty water. When he was finished, He snatched up the pitcher and poured some more. He did this 3 times until he was completely sated. Hungry? He slowly lowered the bowl, peering at the lady over the rim of it. She swayed in the door, smiling at him. Did she never stop smiling? Who was she, anyway? He was, in truth, afraid to ask. A little, he confessed, wiping his mouth on his sleeve and grimacing as bits of dried blood clung to his skin. She moved into the room and he backed away, feeling cornered. Both elegant hands reached out to cradle one of the vines that branched along the wall, which had grown into a veritable bush. Something hung between her glowing fingers, and under the light of her touch Ember realized that it was a small pear-shaped fruit. "Eat this." He cleared his throat, setting down the basin and eyeing her from his corner. "What is it?" "The oracle's fruit," she said, as if that should have been obvious. "It is his room in which you stand, and his water from which you drank." "Won't he mind?" "Not at all. This is a sanctuary. You are free to eat and drink of our fruit and water as much as you please, as are all who come here seeking refuge." She petted the fruit with her fingers, and he noticed that none of the vines or the leaves moved under her touch. "Come and eat." He crossed the room slowly, but she made no move to harm him. "How many people have passed through here?" "Hundreds," she said. "But you are the first in many days. I can't say I'm surprised." He plucked the fruit, enjoying the smooth feeling of it in his hand for a moment, and then took a bite. Mingled flavors burst on his tongue, both tart and sweet, and a bit of juice dribbled down his chin. Are you satisfied?" "Well, if I die," he declared around a full mouth, "at least I didn't die hungry." He stopped chewing as she let out a gentle laugh. "What are you laughing at?" "That you would perish, eating the fruit of the oracle." She blinked once, still smiling. "That is a funny thing to say." "Not when the water's been poisoned," he said, indignant. But he finished the fruit, plucked another, and ate it as well. When he was through, the lady drifted back to the doorway. "You may rest here as long as you wish," she offered, trailing down the steps and out of view. Ember hurried after her, suddenly not wanting to be left alone in the dark. "Wait, he wavered on the stoop. The lady was nowhere to be seen. "Hello." He stepped down onto the flagstones, slowly, and shivered, pacing along the stream. The candles flickered from every ledge and he sidestepped a pile of books. He had no desire to touch those. The black alcove at the top of the stairs was the only place she might have gone. Ember withdrew the stone from his torn shirt, blowing on it, but it remained dim despite his best efforts. He tucked it away again and glanced at one of the candles. He cautiously placed a finger to the wax, but it was cool to the touch. Nor had any wax dripped down from the wick. He half expected it to bring a curse upon his head, and cringed as he retrieved it from the flagstone, but nothing happened. Holding it out to light the way, Ember ventured up the first of the steps, glancing first down at the water which sparkled beside his shoes. The candle's flame provided just enough light to reveal a circular stone structure at the top of the stairs, near the center of the alcove. As he advanced, it took shape before him, a well. Yawning wide and blinking away tears of exhaustion, he dragged himself up the last few steps, pulled by a relentless curiosity. He stared down into the water and scrubbed a hand across his face, watching it flow through a gap in the carved stones and trickle down the steps. At the opposite end of the room it flowed out under the wall, but it wasn't nearly large enough for him to fit through. Neither did there appear to be a door in this alcove. Only the well. He held the candle a bit closer, leaning down and peering into its depths. A glistening, reflective surface lay beneath him, as still as the mirrors outside. It was impossible to guess how deep the cistern went, but he studied his reflection for a moment, startled at how odd he looked in the flickering light. Deep hollows ringed his eyes, as if he had not slept in weeks, and dried blood speckled one side of his face. His hair was a nest of tangles and dirt, and the stubble he usually shaved away for the sake of his pride had reappeared. It added nothing of benefit to his disheveled appearance. "No one may see into the well," came a gentle voice from the door. He spun around, "But the oracle." "You are not the oracle." Ember glared flatly at the woman, holding up the candle in a shaking hand. "What do you mean? What am I not seeing?" "The past, the present. Rarely the future. She tilted her head, her impossibly long hair shifting over her shoulder. It was then that he noticed how tall she was, not a giant, by any means, but taller than Ember, and none of the women in the village had been taller than he. The well whispers, and the oracle hears. He turned his tired glare to the well. I'd like to know how to get out of here. Could it tell me that? It could. But you are not the oracle. Maybe, if it's not too much trouble, you can tell this oracle that I require his services. Impossible. Why? She pointed, and Ember held the candle toward the darkened corner of the alcove opposite the well. A skeletal figure slumped against the mossy wall, and in spite of how many bodies he had encountered, it was enough to startle Ember. Most of the raiment had mildewed or been carried away by little rodents. Nothing was left but the bones. Oh. He swallowed tightly. Can you make it talk? The well speaks to the oracle. You said that already. Ember touched a finger to the hewn stone. Well of the oracle, show me how to get out of this mountain. He lowered the candle almost to the water's surface, leaning as close as he dared, but only his own face glared back at him, haggard and pale. Help me, he tried again, too tired to speak above a whisper. How do I get out of here? The candle flickered under his breath, but the water remained unmoved. Ember opened his mouth to ask the lady if she might try for his sake, but the alcove steps had lapsed into shadows and his strange hostess was nowhere to be seen. He sighed and headed back to the little bedroom, each step heavy and slow. A quick glance around the sanctuary revealed no trace of her flaxen hair or luminous attire. Fine, he thought bitterly, reaching the 2 flat steps and ascending them for a second time. Hide yourself then. He brushed the trailing vines aside and set the candle on the stand beside the basin. Then he removed the stone from his shirt and set it beside the candle. It glowed dimly, and he knew if the siren were there she could bring it back to life with a single breath. Groaning, he pulled back the linens and crawled into bed. His battered body relaxed at once and he inhaled deeply several times, grateful for the comforting embrace of the linens. The mattress was not pretty or overstuffed, and he caught a scent of dried flower petals and sage as he sank into its welcoming embrace. As he stretched, a peculiar tightness beset his back, and when he slipped a hand behind his shoulder he noticed a thin depression and bump under his fingertips. He explored further, and encountered several more scars. Ember curiously unwrapped the makeshift bandage from his lower arm, which had remained there since he had applied the nitbran, and swept away the drying leaves. A quick touch revealed a few faint blemishes further up his arm, near the crook of his elbow. The crystals hadn't taken away the sirena's marks, only healed them insofar as they caused him no further pain. He wrinkled his forehead, dismayed, but quickly decided that it didn't matter as long as he was no longer tormented by them. As Ember reclined, arms tucked comfortably behind his head, he noticed that this room also reached to the open sky. Only a narrow gap could be seen, enough to glimpse a few stars. It must be enchanted somehow, he decided. Elsewise, rain and unwanted guests from above would surely have brought the place to ruin. There were too many books strewn about not to have taken some precautions against the elements. Oracle, thought Ember, tugging the blankets under his chin. Strange name. Whoever he was, he must have been a great lover of books. Despite the fatigue, it was impossible to quiet his mind. For when he drifted close to dreams, he remembered the dark-haired Sirena, her ink-blood eyes and predatory smile haunted him without mercy. First she had 2 fangs, then 4, then 10, and then there was nothing but the fangs and a gaping, drooling grin. Thus, though the passing night felt like an eternity, his sleep was far from restful and he awoke many times in a cold sweat. As the sky grew faintly brighter, he found himself unable to return to his slumber. Instead, he stared up at the hollow sky far above him, and watched the stars sail over the mountain. Chapter 21 By Candlelight. Crash. Ember bolted upright, scrambling for his knife, sweat soaked through his shirt, chilling him as a blinding white light flashed overhead. The twisting vines glowed luminous green, and tangled shadows lashed across the door like gnarled fingers. Darkness fell, and it took him a moment to remember where he was. He aimed the knife about the room, breathless. A darting upward glance revealed no more stars. A bit of weak morning light sifted through the thick gray clouds. They oiled across the sky, and a distant grumble could be heard. A summer thunderstorm. Shivering, Ember swung his legs over the side of the bed. He snatched up the candle, leaving his shoes behind, and padded across the cool flagstones to the doorway. There was no sign of the lady. He stood sleepily in the door for several moments, scratching the side of his face, and then wandered back to the basin. It might do to freshen himself while he had the chance. There seemed to be an unlimited supply of fresh water here, and his clothes not only looked foul but stank of dried blood. He paused beside the vines, distracted by the sight of two small blooms growing from the stems he had plucked the previous night. One of the remaining fruits became his breakfast. When he had drunk his fill and scrubbed most of the blood and grime from his skin, Ember wrapped the blanket around his waist and set about washing his clothes, making trips to the far end of the stream occasionally to toss the soiled water. He tugged his trousers back on as soon as they were tolerably dry, and the tattered shirt he draped across some of the vines. Not all of the reddish stains could be entirely rinsed away, but at least the smell of it was no longer offensive. In this manner he occupied himself for the first few hours of the day. The grumbling storm shrouded the sanctuary in a gloomy darkness, and he was grateful for the luminous magic of the candles. Last of all he scrubbed his stubbly face and washed his hair, working his fingers through a few of the fiercer tangles. As he bent low over the bowl, the storm's light grew faintly brighter until he could see a faint outline of his own features crowned by the thunderous sky. Lightning arced about the mountain crags. Ember jumped as a flash of crimson appeared above his reflection. It was distant, but distinct. A head and a pair of shoulders leaned out over the precipice, shrouded in a wild tangle of hair. Water splashed into the basin as he flinched, shattering the reflection with a series of ripples. He glanced upward, craning his neck as far as he could. The figure was gone. Ember shivered, wondering if his nightmares had come to claim him. But he knew Kentucky's silhouette, not well, but well enough, and besides, how could she be looking down from above? Could she have escaped the mountain without him? Whatever it was, it can't get in, he assured himself, weakly. When he was finished he wrapped the blanket around his shoulders very tightly before venturing back out into the main room. He paused at the door and glanced up once more, but there was only the sky and the storm to greet him. Best to be aware. "Hello," he called, descending the 2 flat steps to the flagstones below. There was no reply but the faint resonance of his own voice. Another streak of lightning lit up the room, and all the candles gleamed more brightly for a moment, as if the storm had breathed new life into their flames. Ember trod around them, careful to keep his blanket from sweeping too low to the ground. He headed up to the alcove, retrieving another candle on his way. If the lady would not greet him, then he would see if there was anything to be done about that well. His own past he knew. The present was currently being determined, but the future, now, there were some questions he would like to know the answers to. Did it really possess such a power? The lady had told him the truth about the pitcher, but perhaps she had been deceitful about other things in this room. He hopped up the stairs on the right side of the stream and then circled around to the left, eyeing the water's surface. Reached out. Touched the mossy stone. Leaned down to have another look. Darkness. And his own reflection. Ember cautiously held a finger above the water, braced himself, and poked it. A chorus of ripples branched out from the spot, perfectly circular, but it only warped his own image. He had already asked it how to leave, but perhaps the well could only speak of the past or future. Will I get out of this mountain alive? Either the well did not know, or it did not find him worthy of this information. Shifting his attention to the lonely bones, Ember took a few steps closer and held forth the candle, letting the flamelight play across them. He noted that they were well preserved, and had not been gnawed or cracked like the bones outside the sanctuary. Other than their surprisingly untarnished condition, however, there was nothing unordinary about them. The man appeared to have died while sitting, possibly even in his sleep. Ember knelt, setting the candle near the well, and tentatively reached for the bones. They glimmered enticingly, and he had lost almost all fear of touching corpses during his earlier wanderings through the mountain. Do not disturb the oracle. He saw her almost before he heard her, a flash of white in his periphery. Withdrawing his hand, Ember stood and gathered the blanket more snugly around his shoulders. He turned to the lady, trying hard not to glower. "Where were you?" "I never left." She folded her hands serenely. He considered that, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "Are you?" His tongue stuck in his throat. "A ghost?" Her smile killed the words before he spoke them. "Do you have a name?" he asked instead. "I am but a servant of the oracles," she said, her voice clear and quiet. "What is your name, son of men?" "Forgive me," he muttered, sidling around her and trotting down the stairs, "but I'd rather not say." There was a momentary lull in the conversation, which Ember did not like. "What reason do you have to withhold such information?" came the gentle inquiry. "Plenty." He stopped beside a tall stack of books and watched the candles flicker under the breeze from his swaying blanket. When he glanced over his shoulder, she stood near enough that he had to tilt his chin up to meet her gaze. Another flicker of lightning spilled into the room, glittering on the stream and granting the lady herself a moment of near-blinding radiance. The sky darkened and thunder echoed over Sisters Mountain, leaving them to the light of the candles once more as Ember continued to wander among the stacks of books and scrolls. He was distinctly aware that the lady followed close behind. Her presence was hardly chilling, in fact, he almost enjoyed it, for she brought with her a sort of warmth. The kind that could not be explained, was hardly felt, but made one believe themselves slightly safer in the company of such a being. Rather, it was her absence upon his awakening, he realized with some surprise, which had disturbed him more than her sudden appearance. "What are you?" "A servant of the oracles." Ember squinted at her, put off by the ageless, endless smile, and then went back to perusing the books on the floor. Some of them were simple and bound with leather, others with strange cloth coverings, and not all of them were titled. Those that were ranged from the ornate with gold embossing to simple etchings in leather. He eyed them jealously. "But," he pressed, stooping to examine one of the thick leather-bound volumes, "what are you? Are you like me?" A strange question. "I don't think it's strange at all," he said tightly. The cover of the book proclaimed in gilded letters, "The Shaping of Magic." Swallowing once, he tapped it with a finger. But the pages remained inert. Perhaps it was not like the entity which had welcomed him to the mountain. At length he flipped it open, curious. At the front of the book was a strange introduction. It was full of long words that took him some time to decipher or that he could not understand at all, bordered by lovely illustrations of nature, most of which Ember found familiar. It awed him slightly to think that perhaps the man or woman who inked those lines had drawn inspiration from the very valley in which he had grown up. Unlike the whimsical tapestries outside, these images were static, if elaborate. The lady watched him, silently. He waited, never once looking up. At last she said, "You do not know." Ember flipped to a new page, hardly concentrating on the literature now, and chose his next words carefully. "Perhaps, if you were to tell me, I would remember better. I am the keeper of these books." She gestured to the one he had opened. "My only purpose is to serve the oracles, attend to this garden, and sustain all those who come here seeking comfort. Do you understand?" He frowned. "I think it's becoming clearer." Her repetitive speech, the strange emphasis on her purpose there, and her seemingly ethereal nature warned Ember that she was not a real person at all, but most likely one of the room's many enchantments. It was as much a relief as a disappointment, even if she were real in the material sense of the word. What sort of creature could have survived so many years alone in this war-torn mountain? "You have not told me how your fellows fared," she reminded him gently, freezing his hand upon the page. "What would you like to hear?" he muttered. "Whether the tides have turned in our favor. The last warrior to seek refuge here brought word that the passageway to Northall had been sealed. How goes the battle?" "Battle?" Ember tried not to let his interest show on his face. "So there was a war after all? That must have been ages ago." Pretty grim, I'd say, from the looks of things. That is all the news you have brought." He hemmed and shrugged rather awkwardly. More thunder grumbled in the distance. As he flipped to the next page, Ember was confronted by an illustration that took his breath away, a shockingly detailed portrait of a woman with long hair and a delicate, pointed nose. The eyes were inked and fully black, but for a tiny white reflection, and two webbed ears framed her narrow face. Her lips were parted in a savage snarl, the entirety of her features ridged with iron wicked thoughts, and two fangs gleamed within the darkness of her gaping mouth. Ember stared, spellbound. The hair appeared to be fair and the proportions of the face were too thin, but it bore such a striking resemblance to the visage that had haunted him hundredfold in the hall of mirrors that he broke out into a cold sweat. He shifted his finger from the illustration to the words on the page beside it, hunching down as if having his nose to the paper would make it easier to read. Of darker magic, sirens. The lady swayed forward, her serene glow illuminating the pages. There were, of course, some differences of spelling and manners of speech, but the following is more or less what Ember, after much mumbled frustration, was able to make out. It hath not been made known to me at the time of this writing what the origins of the river people may be. If ever it was known that knowledge hath been lost, and more pity upon us. They are named the Crusade by the devout, and as sirens to seafaring men. These fiendish entities indwell that order of innate magic which respectable weavers may avoid. It is thought that they were shaped by it themselves, long ago, and are proficient in the wielding of it, such that no common spell weaver may contend with them. Sirens prey upon weak and strong alike, making no distinction amongst man, nor woman, nor child. Many have attempted to reason with the sirens and, to my knowledge, all have failed. There be written no accounts of any such success by means of our magic, and no manner of persuasion can dissuade them from their hunger. They seek and devour the hearts of men, and to this end I dread that there can be no reconciling. It is a peculiar thing, that they have such a bind toward the knowing of human bones, when there are many creatures of the sea and land alike who do not make such fight as we, the sons of men. Beware, all weavers young and yield, lest ye be ensnared. That book, the lady's voice startled him, is often requested by those who visit the oracle's garden. There are others which may provide further insights concerning your adversary. Would you like to read them? Ember took a deep breath and considered the inky portrait for a moment, wondering who the artist had been and how he had come into contact with a sirena. Was she rendered from the descriptions of others, or a depiction conjured by the author himself after a frightening encounter? My adversary. He brushed his thumb over the snarling face, bewitched by the simple realism of it. The portrayal had not been penned, he felt, with ill will. In fact, each feature was inked with what might almost be called a loving attention to detail. Clearly the artist was obsessed with the sirens or his own dedication to his craft. Perhaps both. Yes, he said, rousing himself from thought. I would like to read them. Where are they? And the lady smiled warmly, pointing out another book pile a few paces away. The one at the bottom of this pile, she said. And when you have finished, there is a scroll near the steps that contains several interesting personal accounts. For a moment, he half expected her to say more, but noticed that her gaze had drifted over his head. Her smile was gone. He glanced over his shoulder, but nothing caught his interest. What are you looking at? She bestirred herself, and for the first time since their meeting he saw the entirety of her being flicker faintly, betraying the illusion of life. My apologies, son of man. There are many foul forces and mislaid spells which wander furly beyond these walls, and I can hear more of their mutterings today. It is possible that you granted them access when you entered this sanctuary. It has been so long since a warrior has sought refuge here. Ember glanced around the entire room as a shiver touched his spine. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Such blame is not yours to take, she intoned firmly. Many dark things awakened when the enemy stormed our mountain. What sort of dark things? She stared at him blankly, and flickered again. I do not know, but I do not wish for them to know you. Can you keep me safe? He inquired as his heart gave a heavy thump. Yet, despite his growing annoyance at the woman's peculiar mannerisms, he felt somehow guilty for making such a request. No, she admitted quietly, clasping her hands. "That is not my intended purpose." His misgivings slowly subsided when no spectral entities appeared in the room. There was only the burbling stream, the dance of the silent candles, and the wild storm rolling over the mountain. The terrors of the gloomy halls which he had left behind felt altogether removed from this place, where he could touch the daylight and see the patterns of the clouds. The lady returned to her pleasant demeanor with an inhuman swiftness. She seemed quite content to lead him about the room, wandering from this book to that one, and answering his simple questions now and then, but Ember was altogether disappointed with what he found. There was no consensus on the sirens' origins or purpose. Some claimed they were vengeful remnants of the dead, others that they were merely spirits to begin with. It seemed that there were many methods by which his ancestors had wielded their magic, and as best he could make out, the oracles were proficient in the art of dreaming and glimpsing the future or the past. One seemingly respected oracle, a dream-ridden by the name of Illustrian Kingswarn, purported that they had once been friendly spirits, driven mad by the encroachment of men upon their seas. When he had exhausted what few resources there were, including a book full of riddles and rhymes that only served to make him feel stupid, Ember realized the storm had passed and it was getting quite dark. Only a few lingering streaks of orange and purple tinted the clouds overhead. However, he had no wish to go to sleep just yet, for that would mean facing another night of horrors. "Which of these books is your favorite?" he asked on a whim. The lady blinked at him, and then said slowly, "Can you please rephrase your question?" Uneasiness crept over him. He watched her for a moment, but she made no sudden movements, though he thought, as he stared, a few of her fingers twitched faintly. "Your favorite," he repeated cautiously. "I just wondered." "My favorite?" "Yes, the book you like best." She narrowed her eyes at him, the first of her expressions which had resembled displeasure. "The last oracle was very fond of the book of riddles you have in your hand." Ember wrinkled his nose and dropped it. "But which do you prefer?" "None. I have no preference. I am but a servant of the oracles." Ember pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. "You know what? Never mind. Forget I ever asked." The lady tilted her head at him, neither smiling nor frowning. Then she turned and walked up the stairs to the alcove. For a long while of silence she stood beside the well, gazing down with clasped hands, as if she could see something stirring within its serene depths. He regarded her jealously, and then stole across the floor to the bedroom, loath to interrupt the soft silence which had fallen over the sanctuary after the storm. The linens were in disarray from a night of tossing and turning, and he spent several weary minutes brushing crumbles of dirt and blood from the bed before crawling in. It was somewhat less pleasant an experience than before, but he snuggled down beneath the blankets until he felt reasonably cozy. This night was one of shallow sleep, which granted him fewer nightmares. Yet once, when he awoke, he thought he heard a woman humming somewhere far away. It was a strangely familiar tune, rather sad, he felt. Though he was only half awake, it haunted his fitful dreams. "Down, down to the sea we shall fly, down where the salt winds blow. And whither I came and whither ye went no other man may know." Chapter 22 Wisdom of the Well. Ember lingered beside the heather mattress, staring down at the soiled linens. Mudstains and bloodstains from his first night's stay had ruined the unblemished appeal of it, but he dutifully tugged the blanket straight and did his best to make it look nice again. "Sorry," he muttered thoughtlessly, flicking a bit of dried gore from the pillow to the stone floor. There was no reply. Nobody cared. Nobody needed this room. Consumed by an aching loneliness, Ember shrugged his shirt over his head, snatched another fruit from the twisting vines, and stepped out into the central chamber. Early morning sunlight spilled down at a steep slant through the crag far above, glittering on the tumbling stream and refracting within the crystals which grew along the walls. The crystals in turn scattered that light far and wide in a rainbow of dancing colors. He had only been there a matter of days, but he was beginning to feel restless. "I have all I need to survive," he reminded himself. "There's no hurry." This place was a sanctuary, and had provided him with everything necessary for his recovery and his peace of mind, including an ethereal companion to keep him company. Not that they could do much more than idly while away the days and nights, but it was not an altogether unappealing prospect. He felt safe here, at least. And yet, despite his attempts to shove the terrors which had led him here from his mind, he couldn't help wondering what had become of. "Good morning." Ember glanced toward one of the bookshelves on his side of the stream. The lady stood primly against the wall, her hands folded and a charming smile curling her lips. Candles flickered around her bare feet and upon the bookshelves, wholly unneeded in the brilliant morning light, and a few dusty wooden bowls and stray books resided on the topmost shelf. "Good morning." Ember hesitated. "What do you require?" He frowned, kicking a bit of loose stone into the stream with his toe. "Nothing." "Are you well rested?" "Hardly." But he merely shrugged. "I suppose." She fell silent again, observing him with that winsome expression. Though the longer it remained affixed to her face, the less winsome it appeared. A few minutes crawled by in awkward silence, each staring at the other, the lady with her ever-present smile and Ember with an increasingly discomfited frown. "Can you?" Her fair head tilted, strands of golden hair catching the light. Ember flushed. "Can you stop looking at me like that? I do not understand. How else should I look at you?" The lady's face stilled, her smile slipping into a faint confusion. "That's better. Thank you." "Oh." She blinked at him. "A strange request. Are you well?" But Ember was already trudging along beside the stream, toward the alcove at the top of the stone stairs. He bit into the juicy fruit and chewed while he walked. "Not really. How may I assist you?" "I don't know yet." A strange reply. "Is everything I do strange to you?" "Many things," she called, her voice echoing pleasantly in the atrium. HMMH. Ember decided to ignore the oracle's servant unless he had a question she might be able to answer, for he strongly suspected she would not approve of his tenacity. He did not know exactly what he would do if the well refused him. Only that he would take it apart, stone by stone, if he had to. Clearing his throat, Ember ascended the steps, putting one hand over the knife that was hidden under his shirt. He doubted it would protect him from magical beings or errant spells, but it did make him feel slightly braver. "Well of the oracle," he said loudly, staring hard at it. "I seek your wisdom on two matters." The lady shook her head, but he paid her no mind. "The first of which, I am trapped within these halls. By what paths might I travel to get myself safely out again? Also, I did not come here alone." She took a step closer, her dress swishing around her bare feet, and tilted her head curiously. Ember kept his eyes fixed on the glassy water. "We were unhappily parted in the hall outside your sanctuary. What has happened to her? You might not consider my requests worthy of note, but to me they are of the utmost importance. I beg of you, enlighten me." Rather pleased with his own little speech, Ember stepped back and waited. For what, he had not the faintest idea. A voice, he imagined, grand and booming. But he waited in vain, and after what seemed an interminable lull, the lady said, "Will you not come away and eat more fruit? Surely you still hunger." Ember ignored her. "Show me a way out," he commanded, pointing at the water. It remained dark and lifeless. "Show me how to get out of here. How do I get out of this mountain?" The lady drifted to the other side of the well, her steps silent and graceful, and then clasped her hands and lowered her chin to stare into its depths. Ember puffed out his cheeks in a sigh and observed it through hooded eyes. Maybe there was a secret word, a phrase. "Did your oracles ever say anything to this well?" The lady merely shrugged her shoulders. "You can help me by answering the question," he prompted. "That is not a good and proper question. What if I told you it was a matter of life and death?" "The well cannot speak to you," she said, very firmly. "You are not the oracle." "Stop saying that." "As you wish." Ember crossed his arms for a moment, appraising the well through narrowed eyes. "Show me my friend," he commanded, bracing his palms on the crumbling stones and peering in. He thought he saw the water shiver, very slightly, as if under a faint breeze, but nothing more. "Show me how to get out of here. Show me my friend. Show me. Show me something. Anything," he added hopefully. If the books scattered about the sanctuary had any merit at all, it was likely that the well did not consider the Sirena to be or have ever been his friend. Ember himself, though he wondered as to her whereabouts, was very much afraid to meet her again. But if she had made it out of the mountain, he could at least be assured of her relative safety and proceed without any guilt or regret. "Show me my adversary," he whispered. "Nothing." Ember shivered and hunched his shoulders, stepping away in annoyance. The lady smiled at him, that insufferable, intangible, infuriating smile. The smile which said as plain as words, "I have no real eyes with which to truly see you, no real hand with which to comfort you, no real heart with which to pity you." Her very presence here was a thing which should not be, taunting him with how little he knew about the world he had been so unceremoniously thrust into. He decided then and there that he preferred the sociable persona which had accompanied him to the mountain, slimy skin and inky glance and all, to this nut woman, this servant of the oracles. Perhaps, in bygone days when these halls were filled with talking, laughter, and the living souls of its former inhabitants, she would not have seemed so cold and strange. But now she was merely a relic, a curiosity. Through no fault of her own, this forgotten enchantment represented everything he would be deprived of if he stayed, and sooner or later he would end up another lifeless pile of bones, like the oracle. The oracle. His heart pounded once, violently, against his ribs. "Don't be a fool, Ember." But he knew that what he was about to do was indeed very foolish. "Very well." Ember gripped the crumbling stones for a moment, gritting his teeth as he looked into the water. "I am grateful for the help I've received in this place, well of the oracles. But if you continue to try my patience, you will find me a more desperate man than you bargained for. I haven't asked for much. How do I get out of here? And is my friend still alive? Where is she?" Silence was his only answer. Growling under his breath, Ember turned his back on the well and took 2 steps toward the darkest corner of the alcove. "Stop." The lady appeared directly in front of him, and he jumped, startled. She held out a hand, her face pinched and her blue eyes flashing. "You may go no further." Straightening his spine, Ember moved a step around her. The lady stepped with him, unnaturally quick. "Stop," she repeated gently. "Leave the well. Return to your room." Ember resolutely stuck out his arm to push her aside, and his elbow passed through her shoulder without the slightest resistance. Disturbed and emboldened, he marched forward. She appeared in front of him again, but this time he did not hesitate to walk directly through her. "Leave at once." The lady continually repositioned herself just a step ahead of him, her expression growing more agitated with every reappearance. "Stop. Do not approach the oracle." Ember kept walking. She grew brighter and louder each time she spoke, and he was forced to squint, peering around her in an attempt to see the bones. "If you want to assist me, now's your chance," he muttered. "Will you ask the well to speak?" "No. The well cannot speak with you, son of man, for you are not of the oracles, and the last to be the keeper of these chambers has long been with his maker." "You must not do this," she cried, her voice booming around the alcove so that the very floor shivered with it. "We have sheltered you. We healed your wounds. What reason have you to disturb his rest?" "I have no other choice." Ember reached out, half blinded by her brilliance, and his knuckles collided with one of the bones. It didn't matter which, so long as his foolish notion worked. For if it didn't, he had broken all faith with the oracle's servant for nothing. "No!" shouted the lady, her form flashing so brightly that Ember had to shut his eyes. He dragged the bone from the pile, stumbling in the direction of the well. "You must not. Tell me what I want to know." Blinded, Ember struck out with the shimmering bone. It broke apart in his hands with a sickening crack. Dry dust and crumbles fell to the flagstones. He knelt there for a moment, panting, but no sonorous voice rang out from the well to tell him what the future may hold. And the lady had fallen abruptly silent, not even a whisper of an echo left in the air. Ember opened his eyes and saw the dust of the bone still hanging in the single shaft of weak sunlight that reached the alcove. The broken piece had bounced onto the stairs, resting partly in the flow of the water, and Ember clenched the remainder in a white-knuckled fist. The powdery residue on the well glowed for a moment, so faintly he wondered if it weren't merely reflecting the sunlight. Then something flickered above the stones of the well, He hadn't imagined that. Wetting his dry lips, Ember gathered himself and stood, backing away from the mossy stones. The water was swirling in a slow circle, as if an invisible finger were stirring it from above, and it cast odd shadows of light on the ceiling of the alcove. He swallowed and dropped the bone, reaching instead for his knife. With a dull rumble, more a strain or tension in the air than a true sound, the walls surrounding him vanished in wavering pieces, revealing a wide lazy river, sprawling bank, and dense forest that crept over the patchy clearing beneath his feet and stood thickly upon the other side of the water. It was all very dimly lit and impossible to take in at one glance. The well remained fixed in the middle of the room, rays of light spilling over the stones and spreading along the ceiling and walls, shaping the forest and river in places and bouncing off the stone alcove here and there. Forest colors danced around the room, and his ears popped as the rumble came from the well again. Ember glanced over his shoulder just as a wisp of shadow appeared where the stairs should have been, fading in and out of view. He caught his breath and drew his knife as the light from the well shifted, illuminating patches of color and depth before him as if shaping this mirage from the air itself. The figure flickered. He backed away, feeling behind him with one hand and pointing at the apparition with the knife. His fingers brushed the well stones, and Kentucky snapped into existence before him, as real as any living being. Ember stared, struck dumb. The light twinkled about her form, shimmering so that he could see the crystals of the atrium behind the image, and her lips moved, but only a faint echoing stutter could be heard, as if from a great distance. Fear writhed in the pit of his stomach, produced by the horrible, gut-wrenching idea that he had somehow broken the well. But as light rippled throughout the room, those fractured patches of dense woodland slowly merged, as if the atrium had been an elaborate illusion all along and someone had torn away the lingering bits of tapestry to reveal this hidden nightscape of forest and stars. The trees was lit by a wavering orange glow. Kentucky solidified before him, the cast light softening her features, and he noticed that she was still wearing the same jerkin and trousers. Almost. These clothes were hardly soiled, and appeared almost new save a few grass stains and loose threads. She was breathing quick and deep as if she had sprinted a great distance, and her hair hung loose about her shoulders in wet tangles. It was slightly shorter than he remembered. Her mouth had stopped forming words, but he could now hear her raspy breathing and a gentle chorus of crickets and whistling bird calls. Only a few were familiar to him. Pitch crackled gently near the riverbank, but he could not turn around. He dared not. They stared at one another for a moment in silence. She twitched her right ear, annoyed by an gnat. And when he shifted slightly, her eyes did not shift with him. "Sister." From behind Ember there came a greeting both deep and delicate, a voice like an axe, one edge blunt, the other wicked sharp. Sweet, dark, enchanting. It froze the earth for a moment, and then melted away, leaving him with nothing but the shivers left over. He turned, and saw the dying embers of a fire, over which rested a small simmering pot of stew. It was a homely but delicious-looking meal that Ember wished he could smell, but the dusty air of the atrium remained as it had always been. It was neither the stew nor the fire which commanded his attention. A woman was seated before it, clothed in nothing but the shifting light, and thick red hair, the color of a rich wine. It spilled across her shoulders in sumptuous waves and tangles, like a blood waterfall. Ember had once been impressed by the length and thickness of Kentucky's hair, and she seemed to enjoy playing with it a great deal, but this vision before him possessed a veritable mane, abundant, trailing down well past her bare feet had she been standing, carefully cultivated and, from the way she had arranged it about her shoulders like a winter cape, no doubt a source of great pride. She bore up under the weight as if it were nothing. A taut frame and chiseled shoulders bespoke her strength, but drooping oily eyelids and a slow smile countered that with a peculiar laziness, as of one who enjoyed leisure more than the earning of it. If she had webbed ears they were lost to the luxurious mane, but two black eyes glinted at him. They no more had a light of their own than would two polished stones. Her skin was pale and shimmered faintly, and as he was standing between her and Kentucky, he feared he would be consumed by that stare. "Come and eat," she beckoned him. He knew she was speaking to the other Serena who lurked in the shadows, but Ember found himself drawn, one step at a time, toward the fire. His bare feet pressed upon cold, chipped flagstones, quietly breaking the illusion. Kentucky's footsteps rustled timidly in the leaves, and he felt behind him with one hand, seeking, against all reason, her reassuring touch. His recent nightmares turned to dust before this red-haired beast. They were caught up together in her spell, Kentucky of the past and Ember of the present. Of two things he was quite certain: that this entire forest had somehow been conjured by the well. And, if it were real, the creature who sat before the fire could do as she wished to him, with impunity.